Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Up next on Another View, the story of massive resistance, heartbreak, reparation, healing, through the eyes of Ken Woodley, author of The Road to Healing. In this hour, the riveting story of how one man's dream to right a wrong winds its way through the halls of Virginia's General Assembly and becomes what is arguably the first civil rights era reparations in U.S. history. It was his dream, but he didn't do it alone. Find out what it took for the Commonwealth to say, "I'm sorry," for denying education to thousands. Stay tuned for an Another View Living history lesson. We'll be right back.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. We are so excited here at Another View today. We are up for we've been nominated twice for 2 Virginia Association of Broadcasters Awards. The award ceremonies are this evening. My colleagues here at WHRV and WHRO TV and radio are also nominated for a variety of programming that they've done. And also, a lot of our folks have been nominated for a regional Emmy in Washington, D.C. So today is the awards day. What can we say? I also want to remind you and to encourage you, particularly if you live on the peninsula, to please come out and join us for our live studio audience next Friday, the 28th of June. We will be at the American Revolution Theater in Yorktown, and we will be broadcasting live from there, talking about their exhibit, The Forgotten Soldier. We're talking about the life of Blacks in war in the American Revolution as well as other wars. And so I've got lots and lots of homework to do, but it's going to be an exciting show. It is free. We just need you to come out. And if you would register, go to whrv.org/events and you'll be able to register there. We hope to see you, a live studio audience. It's a lot of fun. Come watch how we do radio. We would love to see you. That's whrv.org/events. And we'll see you there. Massive resistance, Virginia's response to the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision declaring separate but equal unconstitutional. Now, we're all familiar with massive resistance in Hampton Roads. Just recall the stories of the Norfolk 17. But there is a place in Virginia where more than 2,000 African-American students and some white students also were denied a formal education for 5 years. So how does the dream of a twice-weekly newspaper editor to right this wrong come to life? Let's ask him. Please welcome to Another View, Mr. Ken Woodley, author of The Road to Healing, a civil rights reparations story in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Ken, how are you?
I'm doing well, Barbara. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so very much for joining me today. So before, I kind of want to go forward and then go back, if you will indulge me for just a moment. The Brown scholarships that you ultimately were able to get passed in the General Assembly, what is the state of that scholarship program today?
Today, more than 250 of those locked out of schools have participated, have been served by that program. About a year and a half ago, they were concerned that the money might run out and not allow those enrolled in the program to complete their educational journey because there is no limit on how far one can take a Brown scholarship. But then they decided just this spring that they would open up the enrollment period, application period, just in case there's anyone out there who was affected by massive resistance who has not yet applied to participate in the scholarship program. So it is alive and well and operating in the Commonwealth.
That is fantastic to hear. So let's go back to the beginning because you were born in Prince Edward County. Am I correct in that? Or you lived there while your dad was in school? And you also went back there to work. Can you describe for us what Prince Edward County was like for you as a white person versus what it was like for the African Americans who were living there?
Well, I was born there in 1959. and just there until my father graduated from Hampton-Sydney College, just down the road. My parents were from Richmond, so as soon as he graduated, they moved back to Richmond, and I was raised in Richmond. But I had to come back to Prince Edward County because Hampton-Sydney College was the only one of the 4 colleges and universities to which I applied that would have me, so I had to come back. And then I couldn't leave because the Farmville Herald newspaper was the only job offer that I had. So in retrospect, it seems a lot like destiny. And in fact, I know the only way any of these good things have been achieved is because of God's presence and the movement of the Holy Spirit, because thousands and thousands and thousands of prayers have come up through Prince Edward County during all those years, and people began to work together to answer them, and I was just lucky enough to be a part of that. Now, I was at Hampton-Sydney, went back to Prince Edward County. Hampton-Sydney, just 6 miles outside of Farmville, the county seat. And I was there until I graduated in 1979. And I'd never heard of massive resistance. I never knew schools were closed there. Never heard anybody mention it. As far as I knew, Prince Edward County was like any other place. Of course, you're a college student and you're on this campus. You're pretty well isolated in your own comfy environment of academia, and then of course playing loud music on the weekends, and you're not really thinking that much about the outside world. And in fact, when I applied for a job at the Farmville Herald and then accepted it, because as I say, it was my only job opportunity, I ended up going to work for the newspaper that had led the public fight to shut down schools rather than integrate. And it was owned by the same family that owned it back in the 50s, and the same publisher who was still writing the editorials was there at work every day. I had absolutely no idea. Had I known, I never would have set foot across the threshold of that building for any reason whatsoever.
So what brought it to your attention in the first place? That the fact that you were that the newspaper was a part of it, and remind our audience, for those who may not know, about Barbara Johns and about the walkout and how that all tied in to the whole idea of massive resistance.
Well, the civil rights movement began on April 23rd, 1951, and I used to think I had to argue that point. But since the U.S. Civil Rights Trail opened up last year, and they, on their fantastic website, and this Civil Rights Trail links all the civil rights heritage sites in America throughout the Southeast and the East Coast. And they have a timeline of significant events in the civil rights movement. And the very first one is April 23rd, 1951, Farmville in Prince Edward County. And it's first by several years, because what I'm about to describe happened more than 4 years before Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Barbara Johns, the 16-year-old African-American student at Robert R. Moton High School, was beyond angry at the extremely separate and extremely unequal conditions at that school in Farmville. There were tar paper shacks built to accommodate the overflow at Robert R. Moton. 2 or 3 blocks down the road, Farmville High School for the whites was, by comparison, a Taj Mahal, a 2-story brick building with an inner courtyard. Barbara Johns got the idea one night, and she was never sure whether it was given to her in a dream. She is certain it was divinely inspired. And that was to organize a strike. And the next day, she described it as the creme de la creme of the student leadership at Robert R. Moton, a handful of students, and told them of her plan. They spent weeks organizing it. They themselves, amongst themselves, referred to it as the Manhattan Project, as a way to remind themselves that they could not even tell their brother or their sister. They could tell no one outside of that group. And so on April 23rd, 1951, the teachers were ordered out of the auditorium. The principal was lured downtown out of the school, and the students were called by Barbara Johns and her leaders, among them John Stokes. And the student body of about 450 gathered in the auditorium and were told this extraordinary thing, that they were going to go on strike against the separate and unequal schools. And at that moment, they weren't seeking to integrate schools. They wanted the letter of the law to be obeyed. They wanted a new school that was as good as the whites. Well, the students did go on strike. They went on strike for 2 weeks, and they got in touch with NAACP attorneys, Oliver Hill. Mm-hmm. And Oliver Hill and another gentleman, Spotswood Robinson, drove from Richmond to Farmville, met with the students and their family, told them that the NAACP was no longer fighting to uphold separate but equal, but was going after segregation itself. And so the decision then became of utmost importance. What would the students and what would their parents say? Mm. Their response was immediate. We will take legal action to topple segregation. And the Davis versus Prince Edward County School Board case became one of those 5 cases from around the country joined together as Brown v. Board. Mm-hmm. And the Davis case gave the Brown case far more student plaintiffs than any of the other cases.
So who would have thought that a 16-year-old could start such a revolution?
It is astonishing, and truly a little child, though she was not a little child, but a young person would lead them. But to think that an African-American teenage young woman did that back in Jim Crow, Virginia, now Farmville is located between 2 former capitals of the Confederacy, Richmond and Danville. The extraordinary courage, and there was a price for her to pay. But again, I was not aware of that history either until one day. It was in my first year at the Farmville Herald, and I was a cub reporter covering Buckingham County, which is to the north of Prince Edward County. And a Hampton-Sydney professor's wife came up steps to the newsroom, which was on the 2nd floor, and she just stood in front of my desk, and she looked at me with a combination of vigorous anger and utmost disappointment. And she was not saying anything. And I couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. And finally, she said, "You know what happened here, don't you?" And I told her, I have no idea. What in the world are you talking about? And all she said was, "Go to the rare book room at Longwood College," it's Longwood University now, mm-hmm. "and ask for this book, They Closed Their Schools, by Bob Smith." And she shot me another look and went down the steps. I waited about a half beat. I had to find out what in the world she was talking about. And I walked the 2 blocks, just 2 blocks from my office, to that rare book room. I asked for the book. You couldn't check it out because it was rare. It was out of print. And I can see it as if it was yesterday. I sat in a chair to the left of the door, and I began flipping through pages. Now, of course, the title told me something. It gave me a real sick feeling, but it didn't tell me where schools were closed or by whom. But as I say, I started flipping through the pages, and I started recognizing names. I started seeing the Farmville Herald. I started seeing J. Barry Wall Sr. And those words and phrases just flew up out of that book as if they were shrapnel. And it felt as if all the bones had been pulled out of my body. I felt shocky. I was seeing enough to know that schools had closed in Prince Edward County, and that the newspaper which I was working, owned by the family, was so responsible for leading that public fight to shut down schools for 5 years rather than integrate. I couldn't believe it then, and I mean, honestly, I still can't believe it today, at this moment in time, in 2019, that any community could do that to itself and to its children for even one day, let alone 5 years.
I've got your book here in front of me. I want to read this part of an editorial that was written on May 29th, 1959. And you call it the most chilling of all. And it says, quote, "A firm stand was taken by the white taxpayers in 1954 and affirmed in a petition of 4,500 names in 1956, requesting the Board of Supervisors to appropriate no funds for integrated public schools. This does not mean abandonment of education. The Prince Edward Education Corporation stands ready to provide education for all white pupils for the coming year. The corporation will need the unqualified support of Prince Edward white citizens in the troublous days ahead." When I first read that, as I read your book, I had to put the book down for a moment because it sent chills down my spine.
I know exactly why. I mean, it's as if the black community did not exist, just did not exist at all. And that what the only people that mattered were the white people, the only children that mattered were the white children, and to cheer a community on and say, "Oh, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. The white people are going to be fine." I really would have understood just blatant, in-your-face racism rather than words such as those.
So when you found all of this, why didn't you quit? If it disturbed you that as much, what was the impetus for you to, instead of leaving, to turn around and try to do something to right a wrong?
Well, I was 22 years old, and there were a couple of things at play. One, it felt like that was ancient history because it was something that happened, when I was 2, 3, 4 years old. And when you're 22 and you think back to something you did before you were even in kindergarten, to a 22-year-old, that just seems like ancient history. Because the sense of time to a 22-year-old is not what it'll be. When we mature, we understand that 15, 20 years is absolutely nothing.
Right.
And then, I thought, okay, that is a horrific story, but that story, thank God, is over. I didn't understand immediately. It had to grow upon me the understanding that no. That story is not over. That was a chapter in a story, but that all of us are in a continuum, and that story was still being written every day.
Mm-hmm.
And when I began to understand that, and I began to wisen up and understand what had happened, then I began. I did almost leave about 3 years after I arrived. Shortly after I was married, I had a job interview with the Charlottesville Daily Progress. And when I left Hampton-Sydney, I had the typical wide-eyed, senior graduate, sense of naive innocence. I was certain I was going to get a job, boom, just like that at a big daily. I was going to write the great American novel. And so a few years after I got the job there, I had a job interview with the Charlottesville Daily Progress, which would have been fantastic. And I left that job interview believing that I was going to be offered it. But as I was driving about the hour and a half home from Charlottesville to Pamplin, where we lived, I began to feel uneasy, and I could not understand why. But by the time I got home, I felt so uneasy about leaving, which it boggled my mind, because I didn't want to spend a career at the Farmville Herald. But the next day, I called him up and said, "Thank you, but I'm withdrawing my name from the applicant pool."
So I want, because there's so much to this story, and I want to make sure that we actually get to the sausage making, which my audience will understand in just a moment. But you rose fairly quickly within the ranks of the Farmville Herald, and you became the editor.
Yes.
And I want to talk about how you came up with the idea of the creating the scholarship fund.
It was February 18th, 2003, and I was driving to work, and I was thinking of two things. The only reason there's Brown scholarships, and the only reason there are so many good things in the world, and the same can be said for bad things, is that we are inspired for better or for worse by what's going on around us, what other people are saying or doing. We can follow the demons or we can follow the angels. And fortunately, there were a couple of important angels in my mind that day. One, the General Assembly of Virginia was at that moment debating whether or not to adopt a resolution of its, quote, profound regret for massive resistance and the closing of schools in Prince Edward County and the state's role in those closing, because the state did play a significant role in that. And also, a Latin teacher in Prince Edward County High School, Linwood Davis, had just approached the school board with the idea of awarding honorary high school diplomas to those who had been denied the chance to earn a real one because of massive resistance. And it's just in a flash, as I was approaching the Prince Edward County line, those two ideas flowed into my head. And the idea for a state-funded scholarship program just bloomed full-fledged. That it would go from GED to doctorate, whatever, wherever anybody needed to begin and wherever they wanted to go, the state would do it. And it was reparation. It was reparation immediately, and reparation simply means to repair the harm. Some people talk about reparation as if it was a 4-letter word. Just means to fix what's broken.
What was broken.
And the state was going to say, we're sorry. But if you're going to do that and the people who were hurt are still here, then it's far better to say, I'm sorry, and this is what I intend to do about it.
Tim, talk to me about because you met so many people who were directly affected by those 5 years where they were not allowed to go to school. What happened to them, and give us a sense of some of them and what their lives turned out to be because they lost so much education?
Well, of course, some of them had to leave Prince Edward County to continue their education. Some of them, the National Friends Committee, sent out of state. But for so many of those, and it's not just that 2,000, slightly more than 2,000 African Americans were locked out of school for 5 years. That figure represents the number of African Americans who were left permanently without a formal education in their lives. So it's not just 2,000 African Americans locked out of school for 5 years. So their story, there's one man, John Hurt, that became someone. He came up to my office in the spring of 2003 after he learned what I was trying to do and introduced himself to me. And his last name is Hurt. And he became he became the person that I was fighting for, this whole big crusade idea and these thousands of people who were hurt. But here was one man, one face, and we had exchanged an embrace and words, and he was the one I was fighting for, or he represented everyone that I was fighting for. Schools closed after first grade for him. And instead of going off into second grade, here this little boy goes to work at a dairy farm. And he tried to go back 5 years later, but it was impossible for someone who should have been going into the seventh grade to go back to second grade. And if someone hasn't experienced it, they have no idea. And that was one of the struggles I had with the General Assembly. And I remember telling the Speaker of the House, there's just too many people who don't understand the massive resistance. I mean, it was equivalent of a nuclear bomb blowing up in their lives. Everything was eradicated. Everything was irradiated. And so this man, John Hurt, at the time he came up, he was working two jobs. He worked for VDOT during the day, and he worked for Buffalo Shook at night. Two full-time jobs. That was the work ethic and the indomitable spirit that he had that I think represents everyone who was locked out of school. So many people have used the word victims of massive resistance. I never use that word. I say casualties, because they were casualties in the Civil War, after the Civil War. And anybody who thinks the Civil War ended in 1865 is deluded. And anybody who thinks that we're not still fighting aspects of that war now today is equally deluded. It's just, in the spring of 1865, the uniforms went away, and it was harder to tell who was fighting for what. But they were casualties of that war, because what was at stake in Prince Edward County legally, whether or not the county would be forced to reopen schools, that was going to affect education all across America. Segregationists all across the South were watching intently that legal battle in Prince Edward County, because it was going to determine whether they could close schools, whether they could use that as a way to extort the black community and push them back from any civil rights struggles, just with hey, if you're going to push voting rights, look what happened in Prince Edward County, it's going to happen here. So in the Griffin decision, and to me, the Griffin versus Prince Edward Supreme Court decision of 1964 is right on par with Brown, because it made Brown live up to what it said. Despite Brown, Prince Edward County could still eradicate public education for 5 years.
Yes, absolutely. If you're just joining us, we're talking about massive resistance and reparations with Ken Woodley, author of The Road to Healing, a civil rights reparations story in Prince Edward County, Virginia. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Were you as Ken said, casualty of massive resistance? Give us a call. Let us know your experience. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So, Ken, I want to move us along, because I don't want to run out of time, but to talk about the fact that you picked up the mantle and went to and cooperated with some legislators and got a bill introduced into, and it is a long, winding story that the book is about in terms of what it takes in order for you all to get this bill through. But can you talk about a highlight or two that really were some turning points in terms of making this happen?
I was lucky that I had a relationship with Mark Warner, who was governor. He and I had a relationship that preceded his election. And we worked together on the Uninsured Medical Catastrophe Fund the first year of his governorship. And I knew members of his administration, his staff, such as Ellen Qualls, press secretary. So that was really important. If I had not had those relationships, I don't think it would have happened, because I really had to push Mark Warner, and I had to become a real pain in the rear to people like Ellen Qualls, because I had to push everyone in state government to make this happen. One of the key moments was when I was able to get former governors Gerald Bilals, Linwood Holton, and Chuck Robb to come out publicly and encourage, force, push Mark Warner to come out publicly in support of funding for the Brown scholarships, because the General Assembly was fine about creating a scholarship program, but they didn't want to fund it. The House didn't want to fund it a penny. Now, a scholarship is the funding. The scholarship is the money. A scholarship with no money is a lie. Exactly. But that was one of the things that we had to fight. All along, I knew that it was going to come down to veto day. Now, in Virginia, 6 weeks after the end of the legislative session, everybody gets back together for one day, and the General Assembly considers the governor's budget amendments and vetoes. And I knew from experience with the Uninsured Medical Catastrophe Fund that magic can happen, that you can be kicked and kept down for the entire legislative session, but you can achieve whatever goal you wish, provided you have the political resources at your disposal on veto day. So I worked on him to promise to come out with a $2 million budget amendment, which was the figure we were trying to get during the regular session, to promise to come out and bring down a $2 million budget amendment for veto day. And he did promise that. And that's what ended up happening. It was a really beautiful thing that billionaire John Kluge, philanthropist, came out and said that he would give $1 million, and so then it became $1 million from the state and $1 million from John Kluge. But I had been told, I spent the last 6 weeks working with Republicans. People need to remember that we had a Democratic governor back then in 2004, and both houses of the General Assembly were controlled by Republicans. It was very partisan, but at the end of the day, the Republican support was as strong as the Democratic support. And I spent the last 4 or 5 weeks going after the Republicans with what I called aggressive affection.
But in the meantime, you still were the editor of the paper, and you were using this newspaper that had so, in its history, fought to keep schools closed and to keep the races separate. Now here you are writing editorials saying, we got to make this right and we got to change this. And it's still owned by the same family. What is the family saying to you?
By the time we got to 2004, they supported the Brown scholarships. I had some couple of difficult moments in the years before that, because I never asked permission to write an editorial. I never told them what an editorial was going to be in advance. I mean, it was the classic thing. If you ask someone for permission, they can say no. It's really...
So you got to ask forgiveness and permission.
Explain why you did something that you believe was right, and rather than give someone the chance to say, no, we're not going to let you do it at all. But and I've also lost my job on one of those occasions. But by 2004, the family that owned the newspaper supported the Brown scholarships. And I think the fact that these things happen while the same family own the paper, that's part of the healing, hopeful arc of the story, because the broad story, the national application is that if reparations can happen in Virginia, former capital of the Confederacy, with a legislature controlled by Republicans and a Democratic governor, then there is genuine hope for a national reparations program. And if a newspaper can be transformed, its editorial voice transformed from segregationist to all of us as human beings together, skin pigment doesn't matter at all, then that is part of the hopeful story too.
Well, and it's so apropos, especially this week with Juneteenth and also the discussions on Capitol Hill about reparations. But I want to play a clip from Mitch McConnell, and I want to get your response on the other side.
Yeah, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. We've, tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president. I think we're always a work in progress in this country, but no one currently alive was responsible for that.
So, Ken, did you face some of that same type of attitude in Farmville as you were trying to push forth this the Brown Scholarship?
So there are undoubtedly people who felt that way, and undoubtedly felt that way, and felt that way in the General Assembly until they were convinced. And he's talking from the same perspective that I had as a 22-year-old about massive resistance. He's under the impression that all that history is over and done with. He doesn't understand the continuum. He doesn't understand the Civil War after the Civil War. He doesn't understand Jim Crow. He doesn't understand now that barriers are being erected between African Americans and the Poles. And of course, nobody alive today is responsible for slavery, but we are all responsible for this moment in time. We all have a civic, moral duty to undertake what is necessary at this moment in time to repair the harm from the past. The past is done. It's been written by somebody else. The future is going to be written by others as well. This is the only chance we have, and we're the only people who can impact this moment, and it is our responsibility to do so.
So, Ken, let me ask you a blunt question. Would the Brown Scholarship have happened if you had not been a white male pushing it?
Probably not. Probably not. And the fact that I was a journalist, and the fact that I had a relationship with Mark Warner, and everybody. I've thought about this long and hard through the years. There were so many key people who were in place, and I'm a spiritual person. I'm a licensed lay preacher in the Episcopal Church. I'm not dogmatic religious, but I'm a spiritual person, and I've just felt God in all of this. I mean, the civil rights movement was a spiritual movement, and there were just so many people in place at that time who needed to be in place. You could almost take any one of them out. I mean, you take out Mark Warner, and it doesn't happen. So
But
I do think the fact that I was white was probably beneficial. I probably had people pay attention and maybe take it more seriously because of that.
I've always maintained that until we can get white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men to truly understand racism and privilege and all that entails, that the fight for equality and equity is just going to be a really long one. And I wonder how you react to that thought.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, they still pretty much are in charge of this country in terms of political strength, economic wealth, you name it. They have their hands on the levers of power, and we need to bring them aboard. And people need to understand that this is not about pointing a finger at white guilt. This is not a movement of trying to make white people feel guilty. It's a movement to bring all of us together to repair the harm that was done. And I think it needs to be done in a very holistic way.
So beyond your spirituality, what makes you such an ally? Is it because of your spirituality, you think, or is there something else?
No, well, I think I've been spiritual since I was about 4 or 5 years old.
Okay.
I was raised in the Catholic Church initially, and I remember being about 5 years old, and the Pope died, and I cried. I was at a birthday party, and I just broke down in tears because I thought it meant something had happened to God. Literally, a little kid, you know. But no, I've just, and in the book, I try to figure out why I feel the way I do, and I thank God that I do, but I have always just seen people as people. And one of my experiences that really reinforced this was after seventh grade, I was going to Richmond City Public Schools, and that was when the court-ordered busing to achieve integration came into play. So in just a flip of the switch, my public school life went from 99 to 100% white to schools that were 85 to 90% black. And it was black classmates, I'll never forget, that stood up for me against white bullies. And just, I mean, I can never forget studying To Kill a Mockingbird in a class that was mostly African-American students, an African-American teacher, and thinking, you know, my God, how can all my classmates just be reading this and we're having this conversation and they're not looking at me like, you no good so-and-so, look what your kind has done. So my experience in that setting just reinforced it, and going to Hampton-Sydney, which was, 98% white, is just, just could not erase it. It's just, for me, people have always been people, and I've always tried to stand up for those who are being set upon. And
we only have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about the reconciliation light in Farmville. Can you just describe that for us very quickly?
Yes. I was inspired by the state of Virginia Civil Rights Memorial, and I went to one of the last organizing meetings there. And when I was back in Prince Edward County, I realized the irony that here the state's going to honor Barbara Johns and the Prince Edward community in Oliver Hill, and Barbara Johns' own community had never honored her. See, the positive history had been repressed too. And so the idea for Light of Reconciliation came to me, and I took it back channel to the Board of Supervisors. They approved it. A few days later, the real power of the opportunity came to me when I realized that this was a means, the Light of Reconciliation atop the same courthouse, the very same courthouse where they voted to close schools in 1959, that the Light of Reconciliation could not only honor Barbara Johns, but would be a permanent public apology for massive resistance. And that's what it is today. And that is why I strongly believe we need a national Light of Reconciliation on the Mall in Washington, D.C., with the center point of that being the words of a public permanent apology for slavery and Jim Crow, because people can talk about reparation all they want, pro or con, but until we go to the wound itself, which is slavery, until we take ownership of slavery and acknowledge it and repent, then we're not going to repair the harm. Sending someone a check is not going to repair the harm. There does need to be financial reparations, and I think we need the equivalent of a domestic Marshall Plan. After World War II, we rebuilt Europe with the Marshall Plan. We need the equivalent in this country, in rural and urban communities that have significant African-American populations. There need to be massive and enduring investments in everything: education, infrastructure, economic development, healthcare, everything, because slavery and Jim Crow affected every aspect of African-American life. So genuine reparations needs to do the same thing.
So have you been to Farmville lately, and how is Farmville doing?
Farmville is doing well. There's, a lot of people would never believe that countywide elected, and there's about 60% of the voters in Prince Edward County are white, but an African-American is Commonwealth's attorney, and a female, a young African-American woman was elected by Prince Edward County to be Commonwealth's attorney. Prince Edward County voted for Barack Obama twice. There was no backsliding. Prince Edward County voted for Hillary Clinton. And you just see more. I was at a restaurant in Prince Edward County last week, and it was virtually the people there, the customers, it was as mixed race as you could possibly have.
Wow. That's fantastic. So really, we should look to Farmville for some examples and some inspiration on a national level.
No, absolutely. And that's the point of my book, where my book ends, is that this offers real life inspiration. It really happened here. People are talking theoretically for or against reparations, for or against racial reconciliation. I've been blessed enough to experience it. I know it can work. And I myself have stood in front of an African-American audience at Robert R. Moton School, now the Moton Museum, and stood up before individuals who were locked out of school for 5 years. And I apologized to them personally. And I saw the tears welling up in their eyes, felt it in my own. And I know the power of what an apology can mean. So a national apology, people say it doesn't matter, or Mitch McConnell was a long time ago. No.
Absolutely.
No, it's not. We are living with the repercussions every single day.
Ken Woodley, we're going to have to cut it off because we're out of time. I can't believe it. But the book is called The Road to Healing, a Civil Rights Reparations Story in Prince Edward County, Virginia. The author is Ken Woodley. Ken, thank you so very much for joining us today on Another View.
I will be at Prince Books on Sunday. I'll be at Prince Books on Sunday in Norfolk at 2 o'clock.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that information. And we'll be right back.
I'm with Marcellus, and you all are checking out Another View. Don't go anywhere. Check us out.
And welcome back. It's been 156 years since President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, giving the enslaved living in Confederate states their freedom. But it took almost 2.5 years before the news reached Texas. Needless to say, when it did, there was immediate jubilation among the enslaved. The excitement and optimism that came with finally being free is remembered on June 19th or Juneteenth, and celebrated in communities all over the country. Our Lisa Godley was on hand when some Suffolk residents took time this week to remember their ancestors and the struggles and sacrifices they made to make our dreams possible.
Sweet love, sweet chariot.
It was June 19, 1865, when the last Confederate state received word that slavery had been abolished. And while there are theories, it's uncertain why it took 2.5 years for the folks in Galveston, Texas, to be notified. But for the enslaved people on those Texas plantations, the news meant one thing: freedom.
Coming for to carry me home.
More than a century and a half later, that memorable moment in time is remembered in the form of a holiday, Juneteenth, which is a combination of the month, June, and the day, the 19th. I caught up with Lysandra Adams, Suffolk's local history and genealogy librarian, as she prepared the Morgan Memorial Library for this year's Juneteenth celebration.
It's a day that symbolizes freedom.
As part of the presentation, those filing into the rows of chairs set up for the program were taken back in time as retired schoolteacher, poet, and author Sylvia Bond read The Negro Mother by Langston Hughes.
I am the child they stole from the sand 300 years ago in Africa's land. I am the dark child that crossed the wide sea, carrying in my body the seed of the free. I am the one who worked as a slave, beaten and mistreated for the work that I gave. Husband sold away from me. Children sold too. No safety, no love, no respect was I due 300 years ago in the deepest South. But God put a song and a prayer in my mouth.
A change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Juneteenth is also known as Freedom Day, and one way enslaved people gained their freedom prior to the Emancipation Proclamation was by utilizing a network of safe houses and secret routes known as the Underground Railroad. Quilt artist Michelle Petway explained how large quilts were utilized to guide those on the run to free states.
When this quilt was placed out, the slaves knew to follow the migrating geese who traveled north in the spring.
Most were like king size, and they used these quilts to get off the plantation. So when the Underground Railroad started, they would put these quilts out, hang them over the house. They couldn't read or write, but they can read these codes.
So that red X with the black square in the middle would symbolize this was a safe place for you to go?
When the slaves were traveling and they sent that quilt out, that means you can go 4 ways to your freedom.
In addition to taking a historic look back, the program also looked at the future, encouraging some of the youngest in attendance to participate through arts and crafts, or like Naya and Cairo Simmons, expression.
Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights. 1. Freedom, it raps to you. Freedom of religion, freedom to dissemble, freedom to petition the government, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. 2. Right to bear arms. 3. Quartering of soldiers. 4. No illegal search and seizures. You must have a warrant. 5. Cannot testify against self. Have the right to remain silent. 6. Have a right to speedy trial. 7. Have a right to a jury. 8. No cruel and unusual punishment. 9. People's rights. 10. States' rights.
What a way to remember a day that transformed a people's condition and changed a nation forever. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
I just love how those kids read the Bill of Rights at the end. They were really going. That is fantastic. And that's the celebration of Juneteenth. So in case you haven't heard, Another View will be broadcast in front of a live studio audience at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown next Friday, June 28th, from noon until 1. We'll talk about the forgotten soldier, the role of African American soldiers in the Revolutionary War and other wars as well. We would love to have you as a guest. Simply go to whrv.org/events and register. It's free and we have lots of room, so come be a part of our show, okay? And hey, if you missed something in today's show or you just want to hear it again or share it with a friend, visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. We're on Facebook, so like us, and you can find me on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer. And Grace Douglas answered our phones. On a personal note, happy anniversary to my husband, Maxie. 11 years of marital bliss, and I still feel like a newlywed. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so much for listening to Another View.